I'm Daniel Penny, and you're listening to Non-Toxic. This week, we're going to be talking about buying stuff. If you liked our second episode this season with Lucy von Sturmer, you're going to love this one. It's a conversation with Alec Leach, a sustainability strategist, former digital editor at Highsnobiety, and the author of The World is on Fire, But We're Still Buying Shoes, which is a book I'd really wish I'd written myself. As many listeners might know, I also cover fashion and sustainability. I decided to reach out to Alec because I think his book is one of the most astute in understanding how men in particular are convinced, persuaded, and tricked into buying things they don't really need, especially when it comes to fashion and luxury. And Alec had a really brilliant insight, in my opinion, which is that while in the past we might have thought of the female consumer as the model for who buys things, Alec argues that there's a new paradigm at play, that the so-called hypebeast, the nerdy, internet-obsessed, sneaker-loving guy, has become the new prototypical consumer, the type of consumer that fashion and luxury brands have cultivated and oriented their business models around. And it's really important that we understand how this person ticks and how all of us are being trained to become hypebeasts. And Alec isn't just arguing from on high. He's gone through this himself.
I was living ostensibly a very glamorous lifestyle, flying all around the world, going to fashion shows, sitting front row at Prada, getting flown out to Florence by Gucci to go to the same show that Harry Styles and Elton John were at. And, I was doing all this very superficially glamorous stuff.
Sounds terrible, right?
And I definitely started getting to the point as well towards the end of my time at Highsnob, maybe 2018 or so, where I became really conscious of how the fashion industry just doesn't stop. You'd see the same brands with the same collection and maybe just be pumping out more and more clothes. And you start to ask yourself, well, what it's all for? Once you become aware of the environmental impact of all this stuff, it gets quite difficult to look away.
I spoke with Alec shortly after Black Friday. It felt like a particularly appropriate time to discuss this issue. Alec, welcome to Non-Toxic.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Really glad that we were able to make this happen. After meeting in Copenhagen, I've been thinking about trying to have a full-on chat.
Yeah, me too.
I think you do a really good job in the beginning of the book of breaking down the specific psychological and social, I guess you could call them needs, some might call them desires, that fashion provides, or that it at least simulates. And I think this is very important to just understanding the grip that buying clothes has on people individually and the culture more broadly. Why are we still buying stuff?
I guess the biggest thing about the fashion industry is that it's not really so much about making clothes anymore. It's more about a giant machine that produces clothes with a very sophisticated marketing engine sort of powering it. There's more than enough clothes in the world already. And the only reason I think we keep continuing to buy at the rate we do is because there's so much symbolism about what clothes mean, and because buying clothes has essentially become, supposedly an essential part of modern life. Getting dressed and showing yourself to the world through clothing is such an emotional experience, and it's so, deeply rooted with how we view ourselves and how we want the world to see us. So when it came to doing the book and the sustainability conversation in general, I felt like there was a real lack of people questioning why we buy so many clothes. You go to these sustainability conferences and it's all organic cotton and recycled polyester and carbon offsetting and disclosure and certification and all that kind of stuff. And people weren't really asking well, why do we buy so many clothes? And that was something that I just really felt like I could talk about, because in my old job, I was pretty much just promoting consumerism. And, it felt like that kind of cultural, philosophical, emotional, whatever kind of part of the industry was just really, really missing. And so that's why I sort of gave so much space to it in the first part of the book. It's because it felt like it sort of really sets the stage for like how we interact with the industry and how we interact with brands and designers and retailers when we're shopping.
Mostly, you're just kind of a guide into this world in the book, but you do, towards the end, have a few moments where you think a little bit more about your personal relationship to consumption, how it's evolved, some of the failures and some of the successes. And I'm curious if you could just kind of walk the listeners through that evolution, because I think some of the changes in mindset that you're advocating, they can't really just be willed into existence. It's like a process that you have to go through almost emotionally and psychologically. And I think it would be illustrative to hear yours.
I guess I sort of went from, my old job, I was living ostensibly a very glamorous lifestyle, flying all around the world, going to fashion shows, sitting front row at Prada, getting flown out to Florence by Gucci to go to the same show that Harry Styles and Elton John were at. And, I was doing all this like very superficially glamorous stuff, but being paid very little because media, and especially fashion media, the economics of it are really, really tough. So, I was basically wearing stuff that was gifted to me. I never really had the mental space to sort of like start considering what I wanted to wear and sort of how I wanted to look. I was just sort of like really compulsively taking whatever gifted new stuff that I sort of wanted to, and then buying the occasional expensive thing, but I'd always kind of get it wrong. I remember I bought like a purple pair of track pants by this Japanese brand called Needles, which was sort of like very of the moment back in like 2018. And I never really asked myself if I wanted to be the kind of guy that wears purple track pants. Turns out I'm not the kind of guy that wants to wear purple track pants. And I just sort of got to a point after I quit my old job where I looked at my wardrobe and it was just like the most kind of weird, random kind of assortment of stuff that didn't really mean anything to me. And that felt kind of weirdly emblematic of like where fashion is right now, is that people just sort of buy stuff compulsively and don't really think it through. And that was a really big factor behind deciding to do the book, looking at the sort of bad buying habits that I'd built up over the years, and then like squaring that with what was going on in the sustainability space and being like, well, maybe this is kind of like why fashion has such a bad impact on the planet, is because we're just sort of buying so kind of blindly and so habitually without any kind of real thought to what it is that we're kind of letting into our lives.
You trace the roots to this current situation. I mean, I guess there are different timelines one could set, but you focus on the last 15 years. You have a chapter called Everything is Hype Now. Can you talk a little bit about hype and what it's done to the fashion industry and to our relationship to consumption?
I guess I would say hype is what happens when people are excited about something online. I think generating excitement for things online is sort of the main tool brands have now when it comes to trying to reach consumers and trying to get people to buy new things. And sort of like a really cynical leveraging of that has been a pretty important part of the kind of mass market end of the fashion industry in the last 10 years, I guess I would say. The sort of business model that Supreme had, it started getting replicated across the industry.
And for those who don't know, Supreme is a skateboard brand turned streetwear fashion global megalith.
So especially at the luxury end, you had all these massive fashion houses that were essentially owned by a couple of enormous conglomerates, sort of replicating the idea of collaborations and drops and artificial scarcity and things being limited. Essentially, like, the idea is, someone like Supreme basically uses a lot of really smart mechanics to make its clothes have more social currency than they would otherwise. One of the ways that they would do that is by making supply less than demand, which sounds kind of counterintuitive. But if you kind of keep supply just lower than demand, and if you only make like 80% of the hoodies that you can sell, and you sort of do that across the whole collection, it means that in the longer term, there's this real aura of kind of, well, I can't get hold of this, so I need to try even harder to get hold of it. You really like build that aura around the collection. And that's sort of really been used as like a long-term strategy for making the brand seem a lot more kind of desirable than it would be if everything was more easily available.
Historically, shopping has been gendered as a female activity, right? And the quintessential shopper is a young woman. That's what people used to imagine.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the idea of a hype beast has really changed that in some ways, for better and mostly for worse. Consumption as sort of your main identity or kind of habit of mind is now something that any gender can enjoy. What is the hype beast, and like why is this a significant figure for explaining the predicament we're in these days?
It's this like young male consumer that like really loves to spend money on products mainly to do with their backstory and their sort of cultural symbolism rather than the actual aesthetic, I would say. Like people would be queuing up for hours on end to buy, a specific kind of sneaker because it was made in collaboration with this person, or because it was so limited, or because Michael Jordan wore it in this specific game, or, like it's all about the backstory behind it in the way that like women's wear is much more aesthetically driven. The fit and the silhouette and the colors, materials, and the sort of aesthetic elements of a garment. Whereas so much of this hype beast kind of consumer model was based around what the products mean in a way that sort of really called to mind, like, Pokemon or like Magic the Gathering cards or something. It was like a real dorky kind of young men's form of consumerism, but it's been like pretty much the most influential kind of force on the fashion industry in the last few years, because now everybody does collaborations, and the seasonal model where brands would release clothes like every 6 months, spring, summer and fall, winter. This now became more an idea of every week or every month there would be new drops, which was also a huge thing that was pioneered by brands like Supreme. They did have seasonal collections, but they'd be broken up into like weekly or monthly installments. And that's something that's also been replicated across the rest of the industry as well.
Is the consequence in terms of the amount of stuff that people are buying?
We buy more clothes than ever. It's a really, really intense effect on kind of like turbocharging people's shopping habits, specifically young men. But, the model also works across the industry because it's also a very effective way of appealing to women as well. Kylie Jenner Cosmetics has drops. It's like a part of the whole business model. The reason that someone like Supreme became so successful was because they were able to really insert themselves like in the heart of consumers' lives in the way that like shopping became a lifestyle. These young guys that would be at the heart of the industry would be like spending money 24/7. It became like a constant game of having to shop all the time. And, as we've seen with the rise of brands like Shein, fashion's only getting cheaper. And, the whole reason it's getting cheaper is so people can sell more and more clothes. And that's obviously like pretty disastrous for the overall impact of the industry.
When did you start thinking about that physical impact on the planet and how it related to what you were doing in your day-to-day job?
So I remember I was invited to the Copenhagen Fashion Summit, I want to say in 2016. I guess I felt really inspired with kind of whole political element to sustainability and how, there were these really huge questions about the future of the industry that were being asked. And I definitely started getting to the point as well towards the end of my time at High Snob, maybe like 2018 or so, where I became really conscious of like, oh, the fashion industry just doesn't stop. You'd see the same brands with the same collection and maybe just be pumping out more and more clothes. And you start to ask yourself like, well, what it's all for? Once you become aware of the environmental impact of all this stuff, it gets quite difficult to look away.
After the break, we'll hear from sustainability expert Alec Leach on why consumers claim to care about sustainability, but when it comes down to it, They just buy whatever looks cool. This episode of Non-Toxic is sponsored by Blue Corn Candles, a Colorado-based company that's been making handcrafted beeswax candles since 1991. Most candles in the market are made of paraffin, a diesel byproduct that's literally scraped from the bottom of the barrel. Blue Corn candles are made from sustainably harvested and lightly filtered beeswax. The candles smell great, burn super slowly, and most importantly, they don't produce any toxic fumes. For the first time, Blue Corn has launched a new line of scented candles based on the rugged landscapes of Colorado. From the sagebrush-covered foothills of Ridgway to the pine forests of Telluride. During these dark months, Blue Corn is running a special deal for non-toxic listeners. Enter the code NONTOXIC, that's one word, all caps, at checkout to receive 10% off your order. Shipping within the US and internationally. You're listening to Non-Toxic. I'm Daniel Penny, and I'm talking with Alec Leach, former High Snobiety editor and author of The World's on Fire and We're Still Buying Shoes. I'm curious to get your take on the way that male consumers are being addressed in the sustainability conversation. I feel like when I go to these conferences, it's 90% women on the stage, and that's great, but there are all of these hype beasts, as you say, and the hype beast is maybe the kind of model consumer of the contemporary moment. And it doesn't really seem like people in the sustainability world have figured out how to talk to that person. I'm curious to get your insights into, is there a way to address a consumer like this? How do you get people to reframe or rethink their relationship to stuff? And I think specifically about male consumers who seem to respond differently and have different values and ideas about what fashion does for them.
It's a really interesting question. Sustainability is overwhelmingly female, like you said. And I mean, it's also, the sort of cliche of sustainable fashion is basically middle-class white women that live, in a well-off suburban kind of big house that have no idea why people buy cheap clothes. That's the kind of stereotype that you would have. I think the thing with men is that they're just not plugged into the sustainability conversation in that way, because there's not very many menswear brands that really talk about these issues. Or there are, but it's always done. Like I said, there's so much greenwashing out there that it's difficult for anyone to really be taken seriously on the issue. One really important point about men is that they tend to shop a lot more with longevity in mind, and there's still a real culture of buying things as an investment piece and buying things for life, which in my opinion is kind of the only thing you can really do as a consumer, is to sort of buy things with a really, really long-term mindset for how long you're going to wear them and how much you're going to wear them. So it's not to say that menswear is a complete desert when it comes to sort of sustainability. It's just that I think we need to kind of reframe the conversation a little bit more towards buying things because you really want them for life and you want to take care of them for a really long time, rather than it being every brand needs to have this certificate and every brand needs to be carbon neutral and I'll only wear these fibers with this certification. That it's really about checking all these boxes, and it's kind of tedious and it kind of makes shopping just feel like homework a lot of the time, which is why nobody really does it. It's why the whole idea of sustainable fashion is such a small niche, because it's just really disconnected from what clothing really should be about, which is just wearing stuff that you really love.
So I know that writing about sustainability in fashion media is very difficult. Can you talk a little bit about how brands talk about sustainability, and then what your experience has been as a journalist trying to sift through those claims and kind of get to the bottom of what's real and what isn't? And then I guess the big piece of it is, if it's difficult for you to do it as a journalist, what are consumers meant to do?
Yeah, big question. I would say the majority of what we see in the sustainability space doesn't really add up. Brands know that the climate crisis is a big fear for consumers, and they know that they need to be seen to be doing something about it, because, fashion is ultimately about a story about what clothes mean. So it's extremely important that brands be seen to be taking the environment seriously. But brands also know that consumers don't really shop with sustainability as a main driver behind purchasing decisions. People don't as a rule, people don't buy something because it's sustainable. They buy it because they like the style or the price or the fit. So that means there's no real incentive to actually being sustainable. So brands basically just pay lip service to it and, do a green collection or make some stuff out of apple leather or say that in, 15 years time, they'll be carbon neutral by planting a load of trees. The incentive to reduce the impact of making those clothes isn't really there because they just pay, companies in China or Italy or Turkey or Tunisia or wherever to make the clothes for them. So why would you then pay those companies that you don't have anything to do with to be more sustainable?
Yeah, what you're talking about now, I think, is also one of the more vexing problems, which is if things are going to get better, there is going to need to be a huge amount of capital investment. And where is that money supposed to come from? If brands don't actually own their own supply chains, they're not going to pay to clean up their act. And the manufacturers don't have the capital to make it happen.
Yeah, it's a really tough one. Fashion needs to be regulated. It needs to be an industry that where rules are kind of in place to ensure that, proper chemical management and proper emissions reduction, as well as, fair wages and human rights are sort of built into the system. Because until now, governments never really took the industry seriously when it came to regulation because it was never an issue of like protecting consumers. If you're in Belgium or Delaware or wherever you are, like clothes aren't going to harm you in the same way that pharmaceuticals and food and cosmetics could. Politicians and governments are starting to wake up to the fact that like this is an industry that actually needs to be regulated because it has such a huge impact on the planet. And there's a piece of legislation coming up in the New York State Assembly in early 2024 called the Fashion Act, which would basically put all of these much needed regulations in place and would require any global brand with like a significant amount of revenue, I think it's over $100 million, to conform to some pretty strict sustainability criteria. So that to me is the only real way that we will get a sustainable industry, because right now there's no business incentive for it. And that's why we get so much greenwashing. If we want fashion to be a lot more in line with the kind of world that we want to live in, we just have to open ourselves up to the fact that governments need to regulate it. Because before, these companies can just roam the world doing whatever they want. And because there's no harm to consumers in the markets they're selling in, then nothing else matters to anyone. And there's a real lack of democracy and accountability in that. And, as is the case so often with like the climate fight, is like what we're really talking about is just creating accountability and democracy in a lot of these spaces. Nobody's asking for the world to be flooded with cheap crap made of polyester. It's just like a thing that is kind of encouraged by the way the world works right now. And I think if we want to get rid of this kind of really destructive side to the industry, we just need to change the way that the industry works.
And that's going to have to be by force.
Yeah, because otherwise it will always be voluntary. And when it's voluntary, you just end up with a race to the bottom because everyone wants to make more money.
I want to end with this insight that you talk about in the book of reframing an act of buying as a relationship. I think that that's such an important idea. You can actually have a relationship with the people who make or sell your clothes. Like you can have a vintage person who's like your guy. You can have a brand where like they know you and you buy, 2 or 3 pieces from them a year. And it's almost like buying art or like buying furniture. It's more than just the thing. It becomes a way to like have a connection that's a little bit more authentic. And I'm curious just to hear about like what that relational framework means to you and how fashion becomes not about fetishizing a commodity, but about having relationships with other people.
Yeah, I think, the sort of model I come back to in the book is the idea of like new purchases being a relationship. You need to be ready to sort of like put a bit of effort into your wardrobe and, just really basic stuff, like really thinking really carefully about the care label and making sure that you're taking really good care of your clothes and it being something that you really want in your life actively rather than it just being this compulsive thing that you do just to scratch the itch, which is what so much of shopping is about. It's just like, I'm bored, let's go buy some clothes. the way out of this kind of really excessive moment that we're in is just by really questioning what you want from your clothes. And I think when people ask that question, you naturally end up having less stuff. Like most normal people, I think, just want something that makes them feel good when they step out the door. And at the end of the day, that's not really that complicated. It's really just about like figuring out what works for you and, boring stuff like how something fits you, making sure that you're buying stuff that really works with your body, all the way through to like, the overall kind of aesthetic being something that you feel good about and you feel sort of reflects who you are. The more people get in touch with that, the less inclined you are to sort of shop from this really like compulsive place where you need to be buying new things all the time just to feel kind of entertained.
Where can people follow your work? Because I know that since the world is on fire, but we're still buying shoes has come out, you started a Substack. Let's say I want to transform my relationship to fashion and I need a steady drip of your insight. Where can I find that?
Well, you can buy the book from alecleach.com. It's also in a ton of bookshops, or you can buy a digital version for a Kindle. And then, yeah, like you mentioned, I've started on Substack now. So I'll have a weekly newsletter that has a lot of paid, but some free content for people to read. And that's really about kind of getting a lot more kind of granular and getting a lot more in depth into the way the industry works. Like a post I did recently was looking at the overall economics of the industry and how that kind of encourages really excessive markdowns during Black Friday and during the season that we're in right now, which is basically markdown season.
I liked your piece about the Russian oil winding up in polyester.
I think if people want a sort of overall picture on how to have a more kind of healthy relationship with fashion, my book's a great place to start. But especially for people working in the industry, then the Substack is also, I would hope, a really helpful resource for kind of making sense of how the industry works in this current moment of many, many crises.
Alec, thank you so much for coming on to Non-Toxic.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
How do you become a reformed hype beast? It's a question I've been thinking about a lot. Not that I've ever been a hype beast myself, but certainly I'm someone who buys or has bought too many clothes in my life. And I often wonder why it is that I want to buy something. Because at this point, I have a garment for every conceivable situation. And it's not really about need, it's about desire. And often I wonder, is all that energy and time and money better spent doing things that actually bring me lasting happiness rather than scouring eBay? My conversation with Alec left me thinking about how much better my time could be spent and what personal or psychological needs so many people are trying to fill by clicking add to cart. I think there's even a climate crisis angle to it as well, beyond just buying things produces carbon and et cetera, et cetera. There's also just the sense of dread and anxiety that I think so many of us walk around with day after day. And in a moment of weakness or particularly acute unhappiness, you scroll through your phone and you find something that looks nice and you think, oh, maybe if I buy this, I'll feel a little bit better. It's a distraction from whatever ails you. But of course, that feeling never really lasts. And so I've been thinking a lot for 2024 about how to repair and alter the things I own already. I've already altered a trench coat, a pair of jeans, a suit. Shout out to my tailor. And I think I'm going to learn to sew. There's a group of local folks in Cambridge who get together once a month and have like a free sewing supplies. This is my year to take ownership over my wardrobe and learn to repair things myself. That's it for this episode of Non-Toxic. As always, I'm your host, Daniel Penny. Next week, we'll hear from the photographer and artist Richard Moss, who's got a new show up at Jack Shaman Gallery called Broken Spectre about deforestation in the Amazon. It's a mind-bending exhibition, and if you're in New York City, I highly encourage you to check it out yourself. But if you can't make it in person, our conversation is perhaps one of the best ones we've done on this show. This episode was produced by Loose Thread Studios with help from Andrew Lewis. Art is by Sam Creasy, and the music is by Nathan Sharp. This episode is sponsored by Blue Corn Candles, but the real sponsors are listeners like you, and we need your help. Go to patreon.com/nontoxicpodcast and sign up to become a supporter today. Thanks for listening,